Welcome, 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 everybody. A very special treat. We have someone who's very educated and experienced about international policy in different countries, and it's our privilege to have him here. R. James Breiding. He's the Chief Executive Officer of S8 Nations. S8 Nations is a nonprofit organization based in Zurich. The goal of S8 Nations is to connect the most resourceful leaders and thinkers of the world's most innovative nations with a view to learn from each other and spark bold, pragmatic, best-in-class solutions. Basically, it comes from the book by the professor, Too Small to Fail, How Some Small Nations Are Reshaping the World. And this is a copy of that book. That book is the second in line to this book, which is kind of a similar story about you have these very successful small nations. Why are they so successful? The professor is a graduate of IMD Lucerne and the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a senior manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, the director at NM Rothschild & Sons, managing director of Templeton Investment. With the support of Sir John Templeton and other investors, he founded Nascence Capital, a Swiss boutique investment firm. And of course, he's the author of Too Small to Fail, Why Some Small Nations Outperform Larger Ones. He was also a research fellow at Harvard School for International Development, and he founded the S8 think tank. But before we get into all that, Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct? And I believe you had a much more robust introduction into S8, and we'd love to hear that.
No worries. It's good. Thank you, Marcus. That's fine. I'm officially not a professor. I had a fellowship from Harvard, and I've lectured at Harvard and a number of other universities. But just to clarify that, I'm not formally a professor there. So I wrote these books about small, successful countries, and fantastic learning exercise to do that. And I think it touches a number of the points you're trying to raise about social cohesion and inequality and the functioning of democracy. So, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So,
briefly for the audience, elevator pitch. You and I are in an elevator. I'm a major book publisher. You got 2 minutes to tell me why S8 Nations is too small to fail. Why is this a book everybody needs to read? What is the super mega important point that it's trying to make in a roughly 2-minute elevator speech? You got 2 minutes. Sell me the book. What is it about? Why is it important? I get it, but for the audience.
Yeah, so I think that these countries are exposed to external forces, and because of that, they're subject to all kinds of pressures, and that demands for them to be more nimble, to be more experimental, to try different things. And on top of that, because of the fact that they have maybe a superior social cohesion, they have actually an ability to intermediate political consensus. So if they do come up with a good idea, they can actually get it done. Mm-hmm. So I think these two factors is sort of this having to be nimble and adapt, experiment, make some sort of laboratories, and then given their sort of constituents as being kind of having if you like, just a better democracy, they're able to actually intermediate a consensus. And if you look around us, places like the US or Brexit in the UK, or look at the protests in France, it's become increasingly difficult to intermediate political consensus. So that's, I think, if you like, the elevator pitch on why this is interesting.
I found the concept fascinating. As I've told you, I wrote a book and I looked at small nations, mostly for diversity. It was a somewhat different focus, but I do find what you're talking about fascinating. If you look at Hong Kong, Singapore, Israel, Costa Rica, there's these tiny nations that just massively outperform their neighbors. And It's just because they really have their act together. You certainly can't say that about every small nation. What is it? Swaziland in South Africa is one of the poorest places in the world, or Lesotho. But there are occasionally these small nations like Israel where they really got their act together. Not saying they don't have problems, but boy, is that a cohesive society, and they know we're going this direction. And you look at Singapore, it's the same thing. Hong Kong used to be that way. But what lessons uh, are there from these successful countries? I want to avoid the idea that political polarization is just a matter of size, and that if we reduce America, we'll get better, simply because there's smaller nations that aren't as successful. Maybe that is a good reason, but I'd like to focus on other lessons you've seen. What are some of the lessons about political cohesion and dealing with political differences, like Israel? I know for a fact Israel has different political groups that think radically different. Somehow they keep it together. Singapore has 3 or 4 different ethnicities. Somehow they keep it together. What are
Yeah.
some of the lessons these small, very successful countries have that we can apply here in America to help us in a, I feel, very dire situation we're in at this moment?
Yeah. Um, so yeah, there's a number of things. I think one of the points is that society's put a lot of emphasis on education everywhere. You know, it's sort of engraved in all of us the importance of having a good education. So you know, people look at things like PISA scores and you know, getting into the best universities, etc. But you know, I think there's also something to be said about how a society educates good citizens, and I think these countries, they just put a lot more emphasis on that aspect. So I mean, it also helps that they typically go through a common sort of educational process, where in America there's just so many different possibilities. But I think, you know, one of the most important characteristics is that they're able to really train and educate people to become responsible citizens. So you know, they understand government better. They're actually more engaged in political processes. They're better informed, and this is something which you just can't replace. If you want, you know, the input. You know, it's the old theory that you know, you can't have good output with bad input, and I think that's something that perhaps the U.S. can learn. I mean, Newsweek, you know, as you know, a pretty popular publication. They just did I think they came out with a study of 1,000 American citizens. 30% of them couldn't even name the name of the vice president, and 44% were unable to identify the Bill of Rights. And then you had another survey from the University of Pennsylvania, where a quarter of the Americans couldn't even name a single branch of government, and over half of them couldn't name 2 of the 3. So, you know, all that has to really, you know, go back to the primary education system, and that's something that I think America, it would really behoove them to try to improve that, and it'll take time. But I think it's just critical for, you know, to try to figure out a way to improve the education of their citizens. So that would be, you know, just sort of foremost. But there's, of course, lots of other things we can get into.
I could definitely see that. I'm 46, and I always make this joke about this series is about encouraging people to do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. But I remember going to civics and government classes in high school, and the very next year they stopped offering them at my high school. That was 30 years ago or something like that. So I definitely get it. I remember I took the class and I go, hey, good for you, because next year it's not going to be here. And then we got it, and they just stopped teaching that in America. And fast forward, here we are. It seems to make sense. We stopped teaching this. We used to teach it. Now we don't.
Yeah.
Here's the repercussions.
No, I think that's right. And I think, look, I mean, there's some pretty big headwinds in the sense that, you know, if you look at the founding fathers of the American government, or also basically the Enlightenment, the whole idea was that, you know, these people in the 18th century, they realized that you could probably have a better form of government and democratic form of government as long as you were able to get the issues out there and people could really debate them and discuss them and deliberate on them. That this sort of collective body of people, you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this idea of the general will. You had Habermas with the open sphere. And the basic thesis was that if you get it out there and you sort of kick it around and kind of duke it out, you know, that the people, that this free speech, free press would actually come up with the right conclusions. But of course, that you know, there's some real, you know, there's some real wrenches in the plumbing, as we know. But that's what really gave democracy its legitimacy, and that was the whole sort of underpinnings of of Lincoln's dictum, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And freedom of speech, as you know, is kind of the sine qua non, or the most important right of all the rights specified by the American Constitution. It's not only a right, it's also a duty, in the sense that this is what gives people the privilege to be able to participate in this democratic process. But of course, we're really struggling. I mean, in the first instance, you have to inform yourself. You have to be responsible enough to want to inform yourself. And then, of course, we're contending with these issues of fake news, which we all know about. We're contending with these issues about social media and algorithms, which are designed to sensationalize as opposed to inform. And these are serious obstacles. I mean, so we're really confronting a much more difficult environment to actually conduct democracy. And I think the fact we have to be aware of that, and I think the more we're aware of that, the better it is. And I think in our earlier remarks, we were talking about debates and just this culture of being able to debate in a civilized way. This is something that we have to figure out a way to regain, especially now.
I want to ask you about the other, top 2 or top 3 lessons from the S8 nations we could take. But one of the things I want to ask is, they got social media and opposition parties and angry trolls online in Israel and Singapore and many of these other successful S8 countries. How are they able to deal with it? Because they have a lot of the same tech problems we do too in their society, but that doesn't seem to be unraveling them. What's some of the big difference you notice between, like for here, fake news is a problem.
Everywhere.
Different cable channels dedicated to vastly different viewpoints, and people living in their own bubbles is a problem. Social media is a problem. This can't just exist here in America. It's got to exist in these other countries. How do they deal with it, and how do they deal with it much better?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's not like they're perfect, right? I mean,
okay.
We're all struggling with this, let's call it increasing friction of the passage of information and the understanding of information. It's a real struggle. But I think one of the advantages is let's just call it a mathematical advantage. That I don't know if you know this Hungarian mathematician. He came up with this concept of degrees of separation, that you could go from say New York to Los Angeles, and the maximum number of people you would need to contact to get to this stranger would be six iterations. By asking Joe, what does he know this person, and then goes to the next person. So you have this sort of 6 iterations, these 6 degrees of separation. But in these small countries, the average degrees of separation is probably 2.3. So I'm sitting in Zurich, and I just have to call maximum 1 to 2, if at a real stretch, 3 people in order to get an answer or to get in touch with someone. And and that's an incredible efficiency to have, that you just by talking to one person or 2 people, or instead of having to go through 6 or 7 people to get to the bottom of something. And I think that for that reason, we in these small countries, you don't have to rely on the, let's call it the more anonymous media.
Right.
You just talk to people at the grocery store, you talk to people at a bar, and there's a lot more of that type of interaction. And since people realize that it's only 2 or 3 iterations, that gives you a lot more possibilities to either validate trust with someone or to betray trust, because you have, I'm talking to you the first time ever. I don't know, maybe I won't talk to you again for 3 years, but if you see someone every week and you talk to someone twice a week, you can get called out pretty easily and I think that's the key element of trust, is what I call these degrees of separation, the number of data points that someone has dealing with you. And those data points are sources of either validation or betrayal. And that's basically, I think, a huge difference. Of course, now social media comes in and obfuscates that and tries to confuse us. But at least if you have that bearing, if you have that anchor, I think it's much more helpful. And let's see that that's something one has to think through. I don't know what the solution in the U.S. Maybe one has to become more local and more empowering at the local level to sort of compensate for that. But But I do think in the smaller countries, in a place like Tel Aviv or Israel, you just can't get away with the kind of misinformation, for
Hmm.
example, that Trump participated in.
Hmm. Were there any structural things these countries did to deal with fake news or polarization or
I think, we were introduced by Aaron Aryans, the Dutch professor from the University of California, San Diego, and he's done a lot of work about proportional representation. And you see in these type of countries that have majoritarian systems, a sort of winner take all, either Republican or Democrat or Tory versus Labor. It's an incredibly binary decision that you have to make, and you elect Obama, then the next person comes in, he dismisses everything Obama did, and then
right?
Trump gets elected, and then Biden comes in, and they just erase everything they do. And so for long-term problems like trying to tackle global warming or dealing with reforming education or trying to figure out a way to fix the pension system, where you have generations to deal with, it's just impossible to have that type of system. I mean, you need to have some sort of system which gives you a game plan that can be executed over a 20, 30-year period. And I do think that this sort of proportional representation where these countries have several parties
Right.
representing different interests, and I think it also encourages them to be more civil, because you have the risk of, if you really alienate someone or tick them off, they can maybe go to team up with another party instead of yours.
Right.
So I think there is sort of a civility, circuit breaker, if you like. Whereas if it's just a Republican or Democratic Party, they're just more likely to throw bricks at each other because it's just winner take all. No
Thank
more.
you. Thank you. I've had this conversation with many professors, and something like, most of the world's modern democracies don't practice it the way we do here in America. They have multi-party parliamentary systems, whereas we have a winner-take-all system, and they think that's madness,
Yeah.
especially in Japan. And to even top it off, when we installed democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, they did not follow our model. They followed the model of the rest of the world. So we don't even install democracies that look like us. And no
Yeah.
one else follows our democracy. And most of them think it's crazy.
Yeah, no, I think it could be improved a lot. It could improve. There's a lot of things one could do to really improve it. And I mean, the nice thing about the Americans is once they make up their mind to do something, they're pretty good about fixing it. I'm not so sure they're there yet, but yeah, I
Once they
think
make up their mind. Yeah.
once they make up their mind. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we seem to continue debates and not end them that got started in the 1970s. Women's
Yeah.
rights, immigration, gay rights, the role of America abroad. We still seem to. I was watching a documentary in the 70s, same talking points going on today. So we haven't moved forward on a couple issues in 50 years.
I mean, one thing, I don't know if you come across it in your research and in your podcast, but one thing that's been absolutely brilliant and sort of a compensating factor for a lot of the problems that we're discussing right now are something called citizens' assemblies. They're actually designed back in Athens and the 4th century BC, and just as a way of sort of trying to correct some of the deficiencies of the Athenian democracy. And it was basically through sortition or sort of random selection. But did you ever see that movie 12 Angry Men with Henry Fonda? Does that
I've seen part. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So it's a story about these 12 jurors that go into a room, and they hear they have to. It's a hot room, and they have to decide whether this 18-year-old defendant is guilty of murder. And and they presented the case and the facts, and it looks pretty clear cut that this 18-year-old killed this person. And it looked like kind of a more or less a consensus on the whole thing. And then one person kind of stood up and said, "What about this?" And people were trying to put a lot of pressure on this one person to say, let's just get this over with because we want to go home to our families, etc. But anyway, what it's about, it just goes through this whole procedure of how people change each other's minds. And there's all sorts of racial tensions and gender tensions and class distinctions. But slowly but surely, facts are revealed. And essentially the jury goes from being completely almost, except for 11 out of 12 saying he's guilty, to all of them saying he's not guilty. And that process, that deliberation process, is a microcosm of what democracy should be about, right? But the problem is, of course, it's very difficult to do that. And so what they've done is they've adopted these things called citizens' assemblies. I mean, they were extremely successful in Ireland. I mean, I don't know if you recall, but Ireland was like the most conservative society in Europe. I mean, with the Catholic Church being
ban on abortion in the 90s.
Yeah. So things like abortion, all these type of topics, gay marriage, they just couldn't deal with them, and so they decided, instead of discussing them on the floor of the parliament, that they randomly select 100 citizens, and they stick them in a room for 6 months, for a couple days a week, couple hours in the evening, and then they hash it all out, and then at the end of the 6 months, they come up with draft legislation. And so, lo and behold, they've done that, and they've gone from being one of the most liberal, conservative societies to one of the most liberal societies, and they use the microcosm of this of these citizens' assemblies to really, to affect the kind of deliberation which is necessary to achieve a democracy. So in places like Switzerland, you don't really need that because they're pretty good at this sort of thing. But maybe in the U.S., it would be a really good idea to think about using these things more often to really, and they're especially good for quite bold decisions like, let's say, global warming, or trying to put, limit controls of the legislature in terms of debt, because I mean, what congressperson would ever conceive of supporting an initiative to limit their scope of undertaking debt? I mean, it's like telling people to handcuff themselves, or so. It's and it also sort of it avoids the problem that typically you have lobbyists involved, or some, special interest groups. It's just 100 citizens from all the different walks of life, different stages of life, different economic statuses, etc., and therefore that gives it a lot of legitimacy. So it's something that there's a fellow at Stanford called James Fishkin who's kind of an expert at this sort of thing, if you're interested. But but it's something that I think it's really it could be really interesting to think through. And I think I mean, particularly I think you're aren't you representing the senator, or wasn't it the senator of Arizona who was for maybe someone like that who's a bit more independent minded might try to advance something like that.
Cinema. Yeah.
Anyway, it's something I would encourage you, Google it, and I'm happy to provide you information. But that's an area where I think it's quite an effective compensating factor for a lot of the problems that we're dealing with.
You can find out what the people actually think and what the people could actually live with through this random selection of citizen assemblies. Yeah,
I mean, because as you know, I mean, a lot of these issues are very, kind of more value-based than reason-based. So they tend to become very visceral and very polarized, and you have this gridlock. And to overcome gridlock, you have to be receptive to new information. You have to be willing to engage with different perspectives. You also have to show some sort of humility, which is probably more difficult to do in a public arena than it is in private, because it's hard to acknowledge the possibility of being wrong, and recognizing that you have to change your mind, which can often be perceived as a sign of weakness, but in fact it's a sign, it's a reflection of growth and an ability to adapt. So, but that sort of thing happens more, I think, in a more natural way in the sort of closed settings as opposed into a public setting. And actually, the studies show that the people that participate in this process, they become very evangelical, and they're big supporters, and they're kind of like, once you change your mind on these sort of types of debates and these exercises, it's sort of liberating and frees you up. So it's anyway. I think it's really cool. So give it a try. I mean, also, what do you have to lose if you?
Well, that's where we're at now, is looking for solutions. So I definitely consider that an original one, citizens' assemblies. I haven't heard that from other people, and it seems like a good way to get past the polarized climate. If you're randomly selecting people, just randomly and putting them together, it's not going to allow for an intentional, this one's dominated by Republicans or this one's dominated by Democrats. You really don't know. And if you do it a couple times, you should, in theory, get a random, non-political, unbiased, what the people really feel or can live with thing.
And you could do, you could do one in Portland, one in San Francisco,
Exactly,
one in Arizona, and you could compare the results. And since they're facultative, they're not mandatory. They just inform the legislature,
right?
And it's something that doesn't necessarily have to be taken, but it's just a much more reliable source of information. And I just think there's a lot to be said for it. And as you say, we're in a pretty desperate situation.
Yeah. One of the last, I have just a few more questions, and I want to say thank you for coming out. And it was, I liked our talk about Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew that we had earlier. I appreciate that. So most people don't even know who that guy is, and it's nice to have a fan conversation. When I look at some of these countries, and I wrote a book, California's Next Century, and I looked at small, diverse nations. And I was focused mostly on diversity instead of pure economics. But I know, Hong Kong, not now, but in the past, Singapore, Israel, and Guyana. But let's just focus on Hong Kong, Singapore, and Israel. Those are very diverse places. And yet they managed to keep a cohesive identity.
Yeah, no, they are. So look, I mean, first of all, Lee Kuan Yew, he was like the founding father of Singapore. I mean, Singapore is interesting because it's a very young country. I think it just had its 60th anniversary. So it used to be part of Malaysia, and they broke away, and they had to start with a clean slate. I mean, they inherited certain institutions from the British Empire. But, Lee Kuan Yew was really interesting because he was an incredibly capable person, but he did what S8 Nations is all about, which was to say, he first of all, they appointed these fantastic ministers. And this is something Singapore is very well known for having outstanding, they call them mandarins, these sort of people that run their cabinet posts, Department of Education, Defense, Transportation. They're outstanding people, and they're groomed for life to do this type of thing. Well, we can get into that in a second. But he just said, look, go survey the world, go survey healthcare systems, and come back and tell us what's the best healthcare system, or go look at defense systems and conscription for military. So they looked at Israel, they looked at Switzerland, etc., and they came back and they reported. And that's basically what Singapore was fantastic at copying best of class systems throughout the world. And I think the U.S. should do that right now because, frankly, if you look across the entire spectrum of government in the United States, I mean, the U.S. is fantastic when it comes to finding the next Google or the next NVIDIA. There's no question about it. But, what good is the next Google if the boat society is sitting in is sinking? So I think if you look across the whole spectrum, whether it's education, whether it's prisons, whether it's, conscription systems, whether it's roads, airports, highways, police systems, etc., I think it would be fantastic for the U.S. to look over their garden hedge and go survey some of these countries.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee if it was a basketball team or a baseball team, they would not only would they copy it, they'd go and get the best players and bring them back. But they don't. But it's for somehow that seems to work in the private sector, and it seems to work in the sporting arena, but it doesn't seem like politicians or government people are interested to look over their fence and see what's happening out there.
Not in America. Is there lessons looking at Singapore, Israel, and Hong Kong of how they made their diversity work?
Yeah,
could be applied here.
So I think
their diversity work.
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, you need a dominant identity, right? I mean, it's just having infinite diversity doesn't work. So for example, the U.S. used to have kind of the Jimmy Stewart and the Cary Grants, and you had this sort of generation where you had this, for better or worse, you had this sort of waspy characterization of prototypical America, and then everyone tried to copy it. So even John F. Kennedy, he sounded like Jimmy Stewart, right? I mean, he tried to behave, even though he was Catholic, etc. And Obama, and so I do think, so for example, in Singapore they have the dominant Chinese ethnicity, and in Switzerland they have the Swiss German ethnicity, in Israel they have this Jewish ethnicity, etc. So I think you do need to have some sort of, let's say, pole position of, there needs to be some accepted understanding of what exemplary means, what a social norm means, and there needs to be guideposts around that. Okay. And then the second point is that you have to acclimate people who want to be new entrants to that. Okay. So, for example, as you say, in Singapore, they have the Indians, they have the Malays. But those people, when you talk to an Indian, in Singapore, they say they're Singaporean. They don't say they're Indian. The Malays, so you ask them in a cab, cab driver or whatever, I'm Singaporean, and they went through the school system. They also have common housing, so it's a requirement in Singapore that if you live in, it's a big city, of course, so you have these housing arrangements, and you have to have a minimum amount of people from different ethnicities. So this idea of having ghettos is not permitted, and therefore children playing in the playground, Chinese kids play with Indians, and they play with Malays, etc. They play with American expat children, and that happens at the level of the child in a common playground in a common neighborhood, as opposed to having ghettos like you see in different places or projects where everyone's completely isolated and develops in a silo. So I think that's, and I think the third element is that there's an equal amount of opportunity and not outcome. I mean, outcomes are very different, and that of course is subject to performance. I mean, they're extremely meritocratic. So you have huge differences in outcomes, but at least people are afforded the same opportunity in terms of education. And that's, of course, in the US, I mean, it's sort of ridiculous. I mean, it depends on which kindergarten you get into. People are competing for the right kindergarten, and they're fighting and cheating over getting into the right universities. You don't have that in these countries. This idea of having just a couple elite kindergartens or day schools or private boarding schools or whatever, and just these 0.1% go there, and typically not because of merit, but because of legacies and relationships, etc. That's just a very different way to do it, and almost a recipe to ensure lack of social cohesion. So, and then I mentioned this last element about the conscription, this idea that during a very formative period of their lives, typically say 15 to 20, they're doing doing military service over a 3-4 year period, and that is fantastic because it enables them to focus on the we as opposed to the me. This idea that we have to give back to society, we have something to fight for, we have something to build together as a country. It also introduces the possibility that someone who is studying to be a doctor or a lawyer works with someone who's a carpenter or a bricklayer, and therefore they get to know these people, and they get to respect them. They have discussions and dialogues with them, etc. And that only happens in that type of setting, because outside of that setting, it's very difficult to encourage that to happen. So, and I tell you, it makes a huge difference to see, people who've had experience with people from all different walks of life. It's a little bit about what we said about Citizens Assembly. Without respect, you can't have social cohesion.
Right.
And people just, unfortunately, people from different walks of life have, there's an element of disrespect in both directions without that. So I think, I mean, that would be my advice. Same thing in Israel. I mean, I think the real molding factor happens in the military training in Israel. Of course, it's accentuated there because they can actually die. I mean, it's not Barbie dolls and Ken and Joes. it's real life military.
Right.
And I think that's just a really helpful characteristic for these scientists. Um, there's some architectural differences as well. I don't know if you I can just spend a few seconds talking about that if you
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
So I think maybe I just summarize a couple points that I just wrote them down. But first of all, I think as an objective, you have to have a very discernible connection between democracy and the will of the people. If people don't feel that they're playing with a lever, that they're moving the needle, that they have some sort of cause effect relationship with democracy, it's just never going to work, right? So, and I think that needs to be so. As an objective, one has to figure out a way to create a causal relationship between people and democracy. And in the U.S., they've lost that. Let's be honest. And I think, as I mentioned, this idea about educating good citizens, maybe even, possibly even evoking some sort of a driver's license where you have to be qualified in order to really participate in democracy. But that might be one possibility. I think that's I think as well that maybe it would be helpful for the U.S. to somehow modify its reward system instead of just the one who has the biggest bank account to this idea of maybe knighthood, that people in society who are really doing things and helping their communities and having a positive impact and go towards that as opposed to just this incredible pervasive measurement that just a rich person must be good type of thing. So that's at the individual level. I think at the government level, I think if they can ideally eliminate some of these contributors to legitimacy, because people have lost confidence in democracy. All the Pew studies show that I think it's 20% of Americans are confident in their democratic system, and it's slightly higher than a used car salesman. So obviously, government in America suffers from a lack of legitimacy. And then, one possibility would be to go through and figure out what contributes to illegitimacy. So, things like, the influence of lobbyists, if you could reduce the influence of lobbyists in this sort of campaign funding issue, this gerrymandering, for example, this idea of term limits, you have people like, Nancy Pelosi's and Mitch McConnell who,
Dianne Feinstein.
Mitch McConnell, I think he's very capable, and I'm not partisan one way or the other, but he comes from a state that has 1.3% of the population, and well, he has a lot more influence than 1.3% of the population, but just because he's been around for a very long time, and he's accumulated these favor files, where if anyone comes to him, it's a quid pro quo for a favor to do something for someone else, and that's a huge bank account he has. And so I think, whether it's the Supreme Court or people in legislation, this idea, they say in French, to servir and disparaître, to serve and then disappear. This idea of Cincinnatus, where you get called into public service. Yeah, I think this element of public service is a temporary station as opposed to a permanent paid full-time job, let alone career, I think would do a lot to enhance the legitimacy of U.S. government. About the Supreme Court, I think that has to become a much more independent. It used to have a tremendous amount of legitimacy, a lot of respect. It was the highest, the most respected institution in America. But you have to I think you need to expand the number of participants. 9 is too arbitrary. Some places like Sweden, you have 18. You have to choose people based on merit as opposed to political allegiance. And again, I think you need to impose some sort of term limit. Having someone who's, suffering dementia or, can't get out of bed in the morning just because they're too old, etc. It just doesn't make sense. So, that's something that I think could be relatively easily. These are all things that could be relatively easily fixed if there would be some mechanism to do that. So, and I think, frankly, if you don't fix those things, it's going to be very difficult to improve the democratic machinery in the United States. So, I think, and then, just maybe from a structural point of view, we talked about this proportional representation.
Just real quick, we have 2 minutes left, and then
yeah, I got it. Perfect. Yeah. But I think, the mindset, this idea that everything that government is bad, like Reagan used to say, if you want to mess it up, give it to someone in government. And then the people on the Democratic side saying, well, if you leave it to the private sector, eventually it blows up. Actually, these successful countries, they're very pro-business. They're very liberal. I mean, they love to make money. They like to new enterprise. They like entrepreneurship, but they also have a very good government, across the spectrum. So you could have it both. And maybe there just needs to be some new party that says, hey, it doesn't have to be either or. It's not a zero-sum game. You can have fantastic pro-business policies, but also have, incredibly capable people in the government doing fantastic things. So, I think, the America needs to be much more expansive. I think they need to do a new Federalist Papers and go survey the world like Lee Kuan Yew did, and create a new Singapore in the U.S., for example. Why not? I mean, look, it's worth a try. So anyway, that's my, I think I'll stop there before I get turned off here by the Zoom or whatever.
No, I'm sorry. We just, etc. Well, we'll leave it there. I want to say thank you for coming out. Also, please send me an email, and I will forward it to Jim Wonderman at the Bay Area Regional Council. He's president of the Bay Area Regional Council. That's the top 100 corporations in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So send me an email, and I will forward it to him, and I will CC you on that. No guarantees, but it's at least an introduction.
Well, if there would be an event, where I could come and have this conversation in front of people, that, keep it in mind. If there's 50, 60 movers and shakers that would like to hear, that there's a possibility to improve America by looking at, progress has always been about finding something that works and reverse engineering. That's what the wheel was about. That's what the iPhone is about. That's what it's all about. So if there would be a grouping like that of people that would be open to that type of thing, yeah, happy to consider it. Okay.
Yes. Send me an email.
But great work what you're doing, and keep it up.
I really appreciate that. 2 thumbs up to you. Thanks for coming out. I will email you shortly a copy of this video, and I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor.
All the best.
All the best.